Back in 1817, Thomas Jefferson, the former US president, the guy who penned the Declaration of Independence, and one of the most important figures in American history, put in a request for a simple book. Not some rare European manuscript or a deep scientific work, just a basic rule book, a pricing guide that Philadelphia carpenters used every day, and he got turned down flat. The Carpenters Company of Philadelphia, which had been around since 1724, informed the ex-president that their rule book was strictly for members. Inside were the exact formulas they relied on to price out every part of a building project. These were the same calculations behind Independence Hall, Christ Church, and even their own Carpenters Hall. Here was Thomas Jefferson, the man who personally designed Monticello and knew more about architecture than most trained experts of his time, being denied access to that information. It took me weeks of digging to figure out the reason, and what I uncovered had nothing to do with woodworking techniques. It pointed to a complete economic setup that operated right up until 1863, a setup that ran without depending on banks, one that powerful interests later needed people to forget about entirely. My entry point into all this came from an old piece of furniture. My grandmother passed down to me a sturdy oak chair, heavy and well-made, built sometime around the 1840s. Almost 200 years on, that chair remains perfectly stable, no rocking, no squeaks. I began looking into who crafted it. Rather than discovering a single maker's name, I uncovered a whole different way of working. The artisans who created pieces like that chair didn't function the way we picture laborers always have. They didn't earn hourly paychecks. They didn't borrow money to purchase supplies. They belonged to what's known as the guild system. Once I grasped how that system functioned, it became clear why it eventually had to be dismantled. The Carpenters Company of Philadelphia stands as the longest-running craft guild still active in North America. 3 full centuries and going strong. Its members weren't just carpenters, in the modern sense. Back in the 18th century, they went by the title of master builders, handling everything we today divide among architects, engineers, and general contractors. When Philadelphia required Independence Hall, these men constructed it. When the colonies needed a venue for the First Continental Congress, they provided Carpenters Hall, a building they had started erecting for themselves in 1770. Those structures remain standing today, not as fragile museum pieces needing endless repairs, but as practical, usable buildings. The rulebook Jefferson was barred from seeing held something that mainstream accounts tend to downplay. It outlined a pricing approach centered on unit pricing. Each phase of construction carried a set, reasonable rate, not whatever the market could be forced to accept, not whatever price a customer could be persuaded to hand over. Those fair rates came from seasoned members known as measurers, who always operated in pairs or more to prevent any single person from jacking up prices for their own benefit. The whole arrangement aimed at fairness for all parties, the builder and the client equally. Credit lines among community members could stretch out for months or even years without issue. Labor could be traded directly for provisions, for different services, or for raw supplies. A 1928 Bureau of Labor Statistics report looking back at wage patterns put it like this: barter dominated throughout the initial 100 years of settlement, with scarce currency rarely used when paying workers. Personal, direct agreements strengthened community ties. The standard pushback is that this must have been backward and clumsy. Countless local currencies, barter-based exchanges, guilds holding monopolies. Official narratives claim that by 1863 the whole thing had descended into disorder. Over 7,000 varieties of state-issued banknotes were in use. A $5 note from New York could lose value the instant you stepped across into New Jersey. Fake money was rampant. And yes, the disorder was real. The Library of Congress records more than 10,000 distinct, legitimate banknotes floating around, not even including the fakes. Still, I keep coming back to one thing. Buildings erected under the earlier system endure. Furniture from that era holds strong. Communities linked through personal dealings created works that modern methods haven't matched. At what point did disorder turn into the sole option besides central control? Why did we quit questioning whether another path could have succeeded? On February 25, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln put his signature on the National Currency Act. It scraped through the Senate with a razor-thin 23-21 vote, just 2 votes deciding it. The law set up the Comptroller of the Currency Office and launched America's first national banking framework. We're told it happened to bring order, to replace the mess with a single, reliable currency. But the legislation itself spells out the real goal. Backed up in the Federal Reserve's historical records, it aimed to fund the Civil War by boosting demand for U.S. government bonds. National banks had to purchase Treasury securities amounting to 1/3 of their capital. In exchange, they got banknotes valued at 90% of those bonds are worth. Wanting to print more notes meant buying even more government debt. The design was all about manufacturing demand for federal borrowing. Then came a 2% tax on state banknotes in 1864 that pushed many of them out of use. By 1865, a 10% tax basically wiped out state-issued money for good. That's when the bigger picture starts coming into focus. Just 9 months earlier, on May 20, 1862, the Homestead Act became law. It promised 160 acres of public land to any adult citizen for an 18 filing fee. Free land, the ultimate democratic ideal. But estimates from historians show that actually turning that land into a working farm ran anywhere from 1,000 to 200 to 500 once you added tools, seeds, animals, and building supplies. The National Archives says it outright. Very few ordinary workers or farmers had the means to set up a homestead or get the required equipment, seed, and livestock. Most of the parcels ended up in the hands of speculators, ranchers, miners, loggers, and railroad companies. Only about 40% of the claims ever got fully proven up, so the Homestead Act handed out free land that regular people couldn't realistically develop. Then, 9 months later, the National Banking Act rolled out the very banking structure that could loan them the cash they needed. Not random timing, a clear sequence. What replaced the guild approach reveals something troubling. The company town, Lowell, Massachusetts, started in 1822, served as the early model. By the 1880s, roughly 2,000 company towns dotted the country. Employees received pay not in regular money, but in scrip, a token only good at the company-run stores. Records from the Social Welfare History Project explain the fallout. With no outside competition, prices for housing and food in these towns could skyrocket, trapping workers in mounting debt they had to clear before they could leave. 75% of all scrip circulating in the United States came from coal operators in Kentucky, Virginia, and West Virginia. People got stuck there because their debts always outpaced what they could earn. The Big Pullman Strike in 1894 pulled in more than 150,000 workers spread over 27 states. An official national commission set up to dig into the reasons called George Pullman's setup downright un-American. Yet by that point, the company-town approach had already taken over from something else entirely. The guild networks that enforced reasonable pricing. The barter arrangements that tied people together through shared responsibilities. The long-running credit extended among neighbors who actually knew one another personally. All of that vanished. In its place came company scrip you could spend nowhere except the company store. Sometimes I stop and wonder if I'm forcing connections that don't really exist. Maybe the timing between the Homestead Act and the National Banking Act was just chance. Maybe Lincoln's administration was simply tackling several issues at once. Maybe company towns sprang up purely because factories needed workers clustered in one spot, not because anyone set out to tear down the older ways on purpose. But then I think about the people who still live by those older principles. The Amish. They run on a contribution-style economy even now. When somebody faces a medical expense they can't handle alone, they stand up during their regular church gathering and explain the situation. No one walks out until the group has collected enough to cover it. It works exactly like insurance, except it stays inside the community with no outside organization skimming profits. And what really unsettles me is how hard they had to battle to keep doing it. The Amish spent years in conflict with the federal government over Social Security. They saw it not as a tax but as a form of commercial insurance which their beliefs forbid them from taking part in. Finally, in 1965, Congress gave them an exemption. To hold onto a way of life that ran smoothly without banks for more than 100 years, they had to ask Congress for special approval. They file IRS Form 42-9, an application for exemption from Social Security and Medicare taxes, plus a waiver of any benefits. They still pay every other tax required. They just won't join the system that replaced the old one. The very fact that they had to fight so hard shows the earlier system was effectively outlaw. The fact that they continue to make it work shows the earlier system was effective. There's one more pattern I can't shake. Genealogists refer to it as the 1870 brick wall. The 1870 census marked the first time every American got named individually, including people who had been enslaved before. Before that date, following most family lines turns dramatically more difficult. The 1890 census, which could have bridged so many gaps, got wiped out. A fire in 1896 harmed some of the special schedules. Then a major blaze in January 1921 at the Commerce Department building consumed almost everything left. Those damaged documents sat untouched for 12 years. In 1933, Congress gave the go-ahead to destroy them. Just one day earlier, President Hoover had placed the cornerstone for the new fireproof National Archives building. The sequence feels almost staged. The very decade that reshaped the American economy also reshaped how Americans see themselves. Before 1870, you belonged to a community, a guild, a network of local mutual support. After 1870, you became an individual entered into federal records, earning wages, taking loans from banks, with your ancestry traceable only as far as government paperwork permitted. What if the guild ways weren't backward at all? What if they represented a genuine alternative? What if furniture that endures for 200 years and buildings, still solid after 3 centuries, aren't exceptions, but signs of a system that actually delivered? The Carpenters Company rule book stayed restricted not because its contents had some high market value. It stayed restricted because it proved fairness could be built into a structured process, that communities could govern themselves, that no bank had to sit in the middle of every deal. What if debt wasn't progress but substitution? The Homestead Act dangled free land that demanded borrowed funds to make usable. The National Banking Act set up the institutions ready to provide those loans. Company towns produced workers locked into debt they could never escape. The census supplied the official records, piece by piece interlocking, all arriving in that same narrow window of years. I keep coming back to my grandmother's chair, almost 2 centuries old, still dead, level and steady, crafted by someone likely compensated with goods rather than cash, someone who probably trained through a 7-year apprenticeship, someone who almost certainly never filled out a loan form. Then I look at the furniture we buy today, built to break in 5 years, assembled by people earning wages too low to live decently, bought on credit cards charging interest rates that old usury rules would never have allowed. We call it progress. But that chair endures, and the questions keep coming. Why do Guild-era buildings last hundreds of years while bank-financed ones need ongoing fixes? Why was the Carpenters' Rule Book guarded so tightly that even Thomas Jefferson was denied it? Why did the government wait 12 years after the fire to authorize destroying the 1890 census remnants, exactly 1 day before starting construction on a fireproof archives building? Why must the Amish go through legal battles to preserve a system that ran smoothly for 150 years? Why does virtually every American family tree slam into a dead end around the 1870s? The same decade banking consolidated. The same decade the census turned comprehensive. The same decade company towns multiplied. I don't have tidy answers, just these recurring patterns. And once the pattern becomes clear, you can't pretend it isn't there.